buenas tardes. Bienvenidos a otra sesión del seminario Migración, Desigualdad y Políticas Públicas del Colegio de México. El día de hoy tenemos a Ted Gerber. Él es profesor investigador del Departamento de Sociología de la Universidad de Wisconsin-Madison y es además director del Center for Russia, East Europe and Central Asia. Y la entrevista del día de hoy se va a desarrollar en inglés. Yo estoy muy contenta porque no solemos saber mucho del caso de Rusia y del caso de la ex Unión Soviética en términos de lo que sucede en los temas migratorios. Así que el día de hoy un poco la idea es que Ted nos cuente el trabajo que ha venido haciendo desde hace muchos años en estratificación social, migración en Rusia y la Unión Soviética y tratar de entender un poco las diferencias que existen con los contextos en los que estamos más familiarizados en Norteamérica. Así que, welcome Ted. It's a pleasure to have you here today.
Thank you.
As I was saying, Russia is a context that we are not very familiar with, right? And we were talking earlier about the fact that it's the second, or tied with Germany now, you can talk us about it,
Sure.
The second top destination country in terms of the stocks of migrants.
That's right.
So the United States is the country with the most number of migrants, but Russia follows really closely, right, to Germany.
That's right. Russia is really close behind. In fact, as of the previous United Nations Population Division Migration Report, dated in 2005. At that point, Russia was in second place behind the United States. But now Germany is caught up with Russia, and it's basically tied. But the official estimate, and no one knows for sure, just as in the United States, how many migrants there are, because some are there unofficially. But the official UN Population Division estimate is 12 million people who were born abroad, who are currently living in Russia. So, and Germany is, I think, 12.5, slightly more. Russia is a very interesting case. In fact, it has a lot in common with the United States. In contrast to Europe, where the European countries are also clearly major migration destinations. But like the United States, Russia shares a very large land border with a number of poor countries with whom Russia has a long history, shares a common language. So, of course, Russia was part of the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union consisted of 15 republics, including those in what we now refer to as Central Asia, that is Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, I'm missing one, Kazakhstan. Okay. And then the three Caucasus republics, and the Caucasus Mountains is a mountain range between the Caspian Sea and the Black Sea, and the mountains there, or the three countries there, Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Armenia. So those 7 countries, they were all former Soviet republics, and because of the nature of the Soviet Union, they learned Russian. Many people have ties with relatives in Russia, but they're much poorer than Russia is, with the possible exception of Kazakhstan, which also has oil. And so there's just a very natural tendency, given the difference in the standards of living, in wages, in the labor market. There's a huge draw. Of course, in migration theory, we talk about the pull of economic opportunity, and that clearly is at play, driving the large scale of migration from the former Soviet republics in Central Asia and the Caucasus to Russia.
The movement was between these different countries that were unequal, was easy in a sense, right?
Yes, it was easy because
it?
And it remains easy. So I could talk more about the complicated policy issues that have come up. So the Soviet Union, movement was not free within the Soviet Union because of the nature of the Soviet state. It was it regulated where people could live, that you couldn't just decide to move. But that being said, it was much easier to move across what are now national borders that divide Russia from these other countries, because they were all integrated into a single country, that is the Soviet Union. Historically, the direction of movement was in the opposite direction, that Russians primarily moved from the European core of Russia out to the peripheral areas of Russia, and also to the peripheral areas of the Soviet Union, because there were economic opportunities there. The Soviet government, and prior to that the Russian government, sought to develop those areas. They had been historically part of the Russian Empire, And there was always a tendency for the government to try to move Russians out to the neighboring territories to take on leadership posts in the developmental goals of those areas. And so it was in the Soviet Union. So during the Soviet Union, there was a tendency for ethnic Russians to move from Russia. So after the Soviet Union collapsed, which happened at the end of 1991, all of a sudden, the ethnic Russians who were living in places like Tajikistan and Kazakhstan, they suddenly became, they went from being an ethnic majority, because in the Soviet Union, Russians were the predominant ethnic group, the ethnic majority. They went to becoming minorities overnight. And so the first wave of migration after the Soviet collapse during the 1990s consisted of largely ethnic Russians moving, I want to say back to, but in some cases they were actually born in these territories, because of course the Russians who came there to take on positions in the local Communist Party structures, for example, then they had children. But so it wasn't always the case of moving back to Russia. In many cases there were people ethnic Russians who had been born in places like Tajikistan or Kyrgyzstan, and they moved back to Russia because they were very uncertain about their prospects, given that all of a sudden, overnight, without moving, they had become ethnic minorities in these newly independent countries. So there was a massive wave of return migration to Russia in the 1990s, even though the Russian economy itself was suffering tremendously as a result of the so-called shock therapy reforms, the market liberalization that was implemented and that led to severe economic and protracted economic crisis all the way through the 1990s. So that tendency, that the wave of so-called return ethnic Russian migration, it more or less played itself out by the end of the 1990s. And so then there was a bit of a lull. And if you look at the figures for the annual in-migration rates, which the Russian government maintains, you'll see that there was really a peak in the early 1990s, and it sort of declined. But then it picked up again in the 2000s. What happened was the Russian economy really picked up after its more or less decade of turmoil following the Soviet collapse. Oil prices in the international market soared, and sort of natural gas prices. And President Putin, who became president of the country in 2000, also implemented a series of early reforms, which were quite effective. And but by and large, the Russian economic juggernaut, as we say, the Russian economy really took off in the 2000s. And so that provoked then another wave of migration, but this time of a very different nature, that rather than permanent return ethnic Russian migration, now in the 2000s, you had the rise of short-term labor migration of the type we observed, for example, largely from Mexico to the United States. And so Central Asians, people from the South Caucasus, Georgians, Armenians, they travel to Russia seeking jobs. Now, the policy.
Yeah, I was going to say, because, sorry to interrupt. Sure. Usually policies lag behind, right? They are a response to these movements. So I'm really curious, first of all, how did policy change during the 1990s with the return? Were there policies to reincorporate these ethnic Russians or to incorporate the children? It's something that we're discussing right now in Mexico. And is it different to the different policies that were implemented in a moment where the economic boom required migrant labor? Was there a response, an immediate response? Was it a planned response? Did the government think we need to define policy to actually boost the economy?
Well, the government, so the policy has changed over time. In the 1990s, the government was trying to develop a coherent policy, and it was, as it continues to be, it was sort of torn by different prerogatives or different priorities. So on the one hand, in the 90s, the government recognized that, it felt a sense of affinity. So the Russian government, so now Russia was an independent country, and it had a sense of loyalty or affinity with what the Russian government refers to as Russian compatriots, that is, ethnic Russians who are living abroad. And initially, it was open to allowing them to come back, but it didn't specifically encourage that. That changed because Partly in connection with the economic crisis associated with the Soviet collapse, Russia also experienced a demographic crisis in the form of sharp declines in fertility rates and sharp increases in mortality. So the Russian population really began shrinking dramatically and shrank through the process of natural increase or decrease by up to 1 million people a year in the course of the 1990s. So quickly the government realized that they had a population problem. They had a shrinking population. It's a labor-intensive economy. They don't have, they have very low labor productivity. Russia, seeks to be a global power. It needs a very large army. So there are concerns about the military, being able to staff the military well into the future. There are also ethnic concerns that Russia is a multi-ethnic society. There are both indigenous groups, there are groups that have long lived within Russia, and among nationalists there was a concern that the stock of ethnic Russians would be diluted. There's a concern that the Chinese would be migrating. China is a very large country with excess population. And so for these reasons, the government soon decided to pursue a policy to welcome Russian compatriots. And to this day, one can obtain Russian citizenship even if one's never set foot in Russia by demonstrating Russian ethnic background, so to speak, similar to say, Germany. So the policy has been to encourage the migration of ethnic Russians, and that continues to be a policy. In fact, it's even a more vigorous policy today. The government has tried to resettle ethnic Russians. It hasn't always gone smoothly. There are many reports. For one thing, the way that the resettlement generally worked is the ethnic Russians would move back to the country, then they would be settled, they would be moved to some area where there was a perceived need for work. And that's not necessarily the areas where the new migrants, the ethnic Russian migrants, wanted to settle. Moreover, the local populations weren't necessarily too welcoming of these newcomers who were culturally very different. So that process has not gone very smoothly, but it remains to be, it continues to be the government's policy. Now, it's very different with respect to the labor migrants from Central Asia. There we have a classic case of a policy dilemma that the government faces. On the one hand, most government officials recognize that the country really does need migrant labor. As a result of the demographic crisis that I described, even though in recent years there's been some increase in fertility, it's far too late to make up for the declines in the labor force that are going to affect the Russian economy for the next 2 or 3 decades. There's a recent World Bank report, for example, that estimates that in the next 20 or 30 years, the Russian workforce is going to shrink by about 10 million people, just because those cohorts are so small from the early 90s and the 2000s. And Russia needs to replace those workers somehow. Migration is the obvious answer to that. So for economic reasons, they need migrant labor. For political reasons as well, the Russian government is seeking to establish the former Soviet republics as a zone of its control. The Russian government sees the former Soviet Union as forming an equivalent to sort of NATO and the European Union. They've initiated a new customs union, which several of the former Soviet republics have joined. They've established a free trade area. It's in Russia's geopolitical interest to establish a sphere of influence, and that requires open borders. At the same time, the Russian public is not too happy about the influx of migrants, particularly from the Central Asia and the North Caucasus, for concerns about the ethnic purity of the Russian population, for classic issues of out-and-out racism. There is a tendency for xenophobia to have been on the rise in the Russian population, and politicians have played up this tendency as they have in the United States. There's a lot of demagoguery who seek to scapegoat immigrants, a lot of the same sorts of anti-immigrant rhetoric coming out of the media, coming out of the government. And so at one and the same time, although they're, from a so-called objective or a purely practical perspective, the government in Russia needs migrants, at the same time they have a problem because in part of their own making, because they've whipped up this anti-immigrant hysteria. And so the policy has been somewhat, it's been convoluted, so to speak. So the big opening for immigrants to migrate from Central Asia and the South Caucasus to Russia is the visa-free travel regime that all citizens of the former Soviet states in those areas have the right to travel visa-free to Russia for 90 days. So they can just walk across the border and but then they of course overstay their visa and they try to find jobs.
So how large is the undocumented population? Is there something?
Oh, it's probably, estimates vary widely. It's anywhere from 6 to 10 million. But it's quite large, and they're only undocumented in the sense that it's illegal for them to work to overstay their visas, first of all, and secondly, it's illegal for them to work without getting a work permit. Now, the Russian government does provide and has provided a series of policies whereby Russian employers can hire migrant workers and give them a formal contract, and they set quotas on the number of work permits that they will give to employers. And so it is possible for potential workers to go to Russia to be regularized, to have official permission. In fact, there's a huge black market in these formal work permits, which are called patents in Russian, patente.
Okay.
And they often, because of course, what you observe is that the employers themselves would prefer to pay the workers under the table, not have a formal work contract in which they'll have to pay taxes, and then they can pay them lower wages. And there are many accounts of exploitation, of deceit, of deception, whereby you have a whole barracks full of migrant laborers, for example, in construction, who are then not paid. There are many reports of corruption at the level of the police, who sort of are bribed to look the other way. So it creates a sort of negative equilibrium where you have a lot of exploitation, but a continuing flow of workers. In turn, that does continue to, the illegal status, so to speak, or the unregularized status of these workers, of course, puts a negative pressure on their wages. They're not able to establish themselves, to register to get services. They often live in very crowded conditions, but that makes it more advantageous to the Russian employers to hire them. So you have this negative feedback cycle.
So very similar to what we see in North America.
Very similar, yes.
And I guess, again, lack of documentation status is a source of inequality.
Yes, it's a huge source of inequality. Overall, just as in the United States, the immigrant population that resides in Russia today is quite heterogeneous. So you can sort of make two broad generalizations. The two largest groups are largely, but not exclusively, ethnic Russians who have returned to Russia, who have established themselves with the intention of migrating permanently. They may not be altogether happy, but they really don't look that much different from the native-born ethnic Russian population in terms of their occupational attainment and in terms of their earnings. Then you have this large group of temporary labor migrants, and within that group, there's a huge differentiation between those who have regular status and those who are there illegally. And of course, the latter group is most subject to discrimination, exploitation on the part of cynical and sinister employers. But there are, of course, many other groups as well. So, for example, there's actually a large tendency of labor migration from Ukraine. And Ukrainians are very similar to Russians phenotypically. Their language is quite similar. Many Ukrainians speak Russian as their native language. We won't get into the complicated history of Russia and Ukraine, but there's been a major flow. Actually, that's the largest flow of, other than the Russians, of migration. And that flow of labor migration continues today, despite the warlike conditions between warlike relationship between Russia and Ukraine in the last several years. But they also, because they look a lot more like Russians and they speak Russian like Russians, it's much easier for them to blend into the local economy, to get work permits and so forth. So the point is, like in the United States, there are also refugee groups. They tend to be smaller. Russia doesn't emit very many refugees, and that's one big source of variation, of course, in the United States. That the U.S. refugee policy, at least until recently, has at least admitted a fair number of refugees, largely for political reasons, but they tend to be much better off. They tend to receive much better context of reception, or experience much better context of reception.
And in terms of family reunification?
Their idea for, in fact, the Russian word that they use to describe these labor migrants is the German word Gastarbeiter. So they call them Gastarbeiter, from Gastarbeiter,
the guest workers,
right? The guest workers. They really do not want to encourage permanent migration, and so there aren't very many provisions for family reunification. Although, because again of this visa-free regime, it's really hard for them to prevent family members to come and join. Oftentimes, I guess they rely on the poor and difficult, crowded housing conditions that many of the new migrants experience. So the policies in turmoil has been changing a lot. There's a lot of public discussions of this. You have policy experts who are advocating for a more liberalized policy, larger quotas. You have public outcry and backlash against the more liberal policy and with xenophobic types of fears. To me, the another interesting aspect is just like in the United States, the xenophobia has sort of two main dimensions. There's both an economic dimension that you do hear rhetoric that Russians fear that their jobs are going to be lost to immigrant workers. But I think more important in Russia relative to that is a sense of cultural threat, the sense that the newcomers represent a different culture, that they don't respect Russian norms and traditions, that somehow Russians feel threatened as a group. It's not so much that they fear they're going to lose their jobs, it's more that they fear that the cultural integrity, the cultural traditions of Russia will be undermined by these newcomers. In the United States, you also get both kinds of perceptions of threat. My sense of it, and this is really just my intuition, living in the United States and hearing how people discuss, is that really, compared to Russia, the economic dimension is more prevalent in the United States, and the cultural dimension is more prevalent in Russia, but they're both important in both cases.
I mean, I guess it's really interesting just to think to what extent in the future, given the demographic context and the demographic need for migration, there will be a move towards more permanent immigration, accepting families and so on, and maybe that will provide better venues for integration, right? I mean, to what extent the policy will actually adequate itself to consider these longer-term citizens?
Yeah, that's a big question with respect to Russia. I mean, I won't get into the United States, but in Russia, the government actually has a lot of control over the situation. If the government made a strong decision that it really wanted to support this policy, it could quite easily advocate for the public to change how it perceives migrants. It could tell lots of stories about how migrants have contributed to Russia's economy. Of course, there's also expert migration, professional migration. The Russian government has tried really hard to recruit a coterie of Russian scientists who left the country in the early 1990s for better opportunities abroad when the Russian science system was in collapse. So in any case, and I've looked at Russian public opinion towards migrants, and it's more complex than one would expect based on sort of the standard account of xenophobia. That there are large pockets of Russian society who are at least ambivalent and some even positive about migration, who understand that migrants play a vital role in the economy, who understand that as a result of the demographic trends of the last several decades, Russia really does need these workers. And I think the government probably has more opportunity in Russia than even in the United States because the government has a lot of control over public opinion and has a lot of levers at its disposal in order to shape how the public views. So to me, my assessment of the situation is it's really a matter of political will on the part of the federal government. Now, the Russian government, the Kremlin, so to speak, faces a lot of different policy concerns. It's currently engaged in a struggle with the West in the United States, which predominates a lot of its thinking, a lot of its policies. It's suffering an economic crisis, a downturn in recent years, in part due to that conflict with the West, but it's chosen to emphasize the conflict with the West and magnify this foreign threat as a way to distract the population within Russian society from its economic woes. And so within that context, it's not really clear. I think perhaps that puts some kind of constraint on the government's ability to implement more liberal migration policies. Because if you're touting the importance of the Russian nation, the importance of protecting Russians from these foreign threats, it's hard at one and the same time to say, well, then there are these other migrants from Asia who are not such a threat, who we want to integrate. So I think that's the fundamental problem that the government faces now. I think there's a recognition that they need migration, and there's a geopolitical aspect of that as well, that to expand Russia's sphere of influence, it's good to have these open borders, to have Russia be the sort of host for these poorer countries and to establish ties both economically and politically. But at the same time, it's sort of trapped itself with this nationalistic rhetoric into a position where it's difficult for it to advocate a more liberal approach.
Creo que el caso de Rusia es muy interesante justo por lo que mencionaba Ted al final, ¿no? la relación entre el este y el oeste, histórica, y ahora se vive muy claramente, hasta qué punto el nacionalismo está justamente definiendo estas trayectorias de integración de inmigrantes, definiendo las políticas internas, ¿no? Y cómo la dinámica demográfica y las necesidades entran en juego en justamente discusiones de amenazas culturales, la identidad nacionalista de los países, sí, etcétera. Y Rusia creo que es un muy buen ejemplo justo de cómo todo esto se conjuga. Y algo que es muy importante siempre cuando hablamos de Rusia es de la geopolítica, la ubicación. Sí, la geopolítica, sí. Así que vamos a ver qué sucede en un futuro, hasta qué punto las políticas migratorias cambian en Rusia. Y bueno, esperando que justamente estas desigualdades que viven los migrantes en distintos contextos se puedan atenuar. Muchas gracias y gracias a ustedes por acompañarnos el día de hoy en el seminario. Hasta luego.